he the Buddha taught that all phenomenon, thoughts, emotions, experiences are marked by these three characteristics of impermanence, dukkha, and not self. And when he didn't mean we don't have a self. He meant we don't have a fixed, permanent self. And that's kind of the fundamental teaching here, okay? In other words, the self is viewed in this context as constantly changing, interconnected, and made up of 5 physical and mental components that come together in the present moment. So let me get into that a little bit, the 5 components. They're called the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas, which is the Pali word skandhas. And I think it's safer to say that we have a dharma self composed of the 5 aggregates or skandhas. The first one, and I'm going to go through each of them briefly. The first one is form, and the Pali word rupa, R-U-P-A, and form is, or matter, is something material that can be sensed. Okay, so my teacup is form. Okay, so and the world is full of things that constitute the first skandha or form. The second skandha is, and remember, these 5 things are make up what we call the dharma self. The second skandha is sensation, okay, and that's Vedana, V-E-D-A-N-A. It's a physical or mental sensation that we experience through the senses, okay? The eye is the visible form, the ear with sound, the nose with odor, the tongue with taste, the body with touch, and then the Buddha added the mind as which is made up of thoughts and ideas, okay? Now, in the Buddhist sense, mind or intellect is a sense organ. It's a faculty, just like the eye or ear. So that's why he included it. So we have the 6 senses that make up the second aggregate of sensation. And because these senses experience pleasure or pain, they create craving. And we'll come back to that. So one of the challenges with the second aggregate is that they create, these sensory experiences create craving. We either want to acquire that which is pleasurable or avoid that which is painful. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 is perception, sana, S-A-N-N-A. This is the faculty that recognizes. Much of what we call thinking fits into this aggregate, okay? The translation of sana is knowledge that puts together. It's the capacity to conceptualize and recognize things by associating them with other things. For example, we recognize that my shoes are my shoes because I have previous experience with these things that I put on my feet. So it's the perception based upon our experience and prior experience and association with similar things. So I know this is a cup because when I open the cabinet, and for all these years of open cabinets, these things sit in there and they are cups. So that's the third aggregate, okay. And I know this sounds a little in the weeds, but it's important to this concept of not self. The fourth skandha is mental formations, okay. All volitional actions, all actions that we take, good or bad, skillful or unskillful, are included in this aggregate, okay. So biases, perceptions, opinions, interests, attractions, all of these are what the Buddha called mental formations, this fourth skandha. And then the fifth one is consciousness, vinanya. And that's the reaction that we have to the first 4. So you take skandhas 1 through 4, and then we look at our reaction. It's an awareness. It's not a recognition. It's an awareness. Okay. So it's not a sensation. That's the second skandha. It's more like a form of consciousness. Okay. And it depends on the other skandhas and does not exist independently from them. Okay, so it's really consciousness. It's the sense experience that relies on whatever's arising. Okay, So one of the quotes that I saw to explain the five skandhas is they are they were compared to a collage, okay, where all the particles are glued together and they come apart, and the skandhas are glued together, they come apart. We begin to understand how fleeting they are, how none of them are permanent, and that includes this sense of self that we carry around, okay. They're subject to change, they're subject to impermanence, they're subject to decay. This is why we say there is no fixed permanent self, because these five things are constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly evolving. But the Dharma self, this thing we carry around, is the sum total of all these experiences. So the skandhas very roughly come together to make up each of us as an individual, our so-called Dharma self. And everything that I think of as I, me, or mine is a function of these skandhas or aggregates, okay. So that's where things get confusing, because the not self that the Buddha was talking about was anything that's permanent or fixed that doesn't follow these rules. You know, an individual is a process of the ever-changing, ever-evolving skandhas, and it creates a self, we'll call it a Dharma self, necessary to function in the world. Okay, so in other words, he talked that you or me are not this fixed entity, but an ever-changing entity. You know, by nature of our whole being in the world, it's ever-changing. Okay. The individual self, what we might call the ego, is really just a byproduct of the skandhas. It's not a fixed thing. There is no self, is the granddaddy of fake Buddhist quotes. So when you see no self, no, that's incorrect. Not self means no permanent fixed self, but there is a self, and we'll just for a shorthand call it a Dharma self, okay? And the reason this belief in no self, which confuses the heck out of most of us, it survives so long because there is a superficial resemblance to this notion of not self. The Buddha taught not self because he was talking about not clinging, that we cling to things, whether phenomenon, experiences, perceptions, thinking we have a fixed self, that's the source of dukkha, that's the source of suffering, okay. He talked about a process by which the mind creates many selves, M-A-N-Y, by which what he called I-making or my-making as we pursue our desires. So in the pursuit of my desires, I create this kind of sense of experience of who I am, okay? He focused on the pattern of selfing, you know, of creating this sense of who I am, which does exist, but it doesn't exist in a permanent, fixed, non-changing way, which is the ego, which is what we want to hold on to. Because he understood that clinging to any of that lies at the heart of suffering. Because any sense of self which we think is fixed and try to hold on to is going to make us suffer, because it's going to change. It's going to constantly be fluid, okay? And he advised that we use this notion of not self, of the skandhas, to dismantle that clinging, okay? So whenever we see ourselves identifying with anything that's stressful or inconstant, he wants us to remind us that it's not self, that it's changing, it's impermanent. It helps us let go of it. It helps us see it in a more spacious and large context, okay? So the not self teaching is an answer. It's not the question of whether there's a self. It's what lies at the heart of discernment. So when I'm careful about discerning my experience, I don't see it from the perspective of one rigid Jeff. You know, I see it from the fact of what's coming up now in the moment, which is always different, always changing, always evolving. Okay. He says in the Pali Canon, what when I do it, meaning letting go of this fixed self, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness. And there he's talking about letting go of this fixed notion of my ego, which is this way, and this is the way I am, and you better accept it, and blah, blah, blah. Now, some ways of selfing that the Buddha taught are useful. You know, when we develop a temporary Dharma self that's heedful and responsible and confident, he talks about that in one of the other suttas. You know, that that it doesn't, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, we just recognize that there's nothing permanent there. And it is a tricky concept because we always want to go back to thinking that this is me, you know, that it's not just that the me of yesterday is not the same as the me of today. Because when there's more clinging, when there's no more clinging, rather, when we cease to cling, we have no need for this notion of a fixed self. Okay, there's no point in answering the question whether there's self because we've relinquished clinging. It's irrelevant to our experience. Okay. But if our purpose in trying to disprove the self is to escape the responsibilities of my personhood, that's not what he's talking about. He's simply talking about these five skandhas, these five aggregates, these ever-changing experiences that make up this Dharma self, and not get attached to or cling to any notion that there's a permanent something there. Okay, so let me leave it there because I'm sure we're going to have some discussion because it's, as I said, it's not an easy concept, and I hope I didn't confuse the heck out of you this morning.
No.